Hello everyone, my name is Ashish and you are watching another web guy YouTube channel, and welcome to another video of CSS tutorial series. And in next 10 minutes, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about CSS Grids. So without wasting any time, let's get started. If you have not yet subscribed to our channel, please hit the subscribe button and also the notification bell icon so that you don't miss any of our videos. In the last video, we saw what is a flexbox. Unlike Flexbox, which is a largely one-dimensional system, CSS Grid layout is a two-dimensional system, meaning it can handle both rows and columns. The grid layout allows us to align components into columns and rows, thus making it easier to design web pages. Just like the Flexbox, a grid layout consists of a parent element or the grid container with one or more child elements. So here you can see I have defined a class grid container, and in that I have created 9 divs and I have labeled them 1 to 9 with a class of grid item. In the CSS, I have added a border around my grid items so that they are easily identifiable. Now an HTML element becomes a grid container when its display property is set to grid. So let's do that. Now all the children of the div of grid container class have already become the grid items. You cannot see any change because we have not yet defined the rows and columns. The grid template columns property defines the number of columns in your grid layout, and it can define the width of each column. For example, let's define 3 columns for our grid layout. The grid template columns property takes a space separated list where each value defines the length of respective column. Here we have done auto, that means all the columns will have same width. You can also specify the exact width of the columns. Here you can see the first column is 50 pixels wide and the third column is 70 pixels wide, and the second column automatically fills the space between it. Similarly, the grid template rows property defines the height of each row. Here you can see the first row is 150 pixels, the second row is of 200 pixels, and the third row has a height of 80 pixels. Let's switch everything back to auto. And also give our grid container a light blue background for ease of understanding. Now similar to Flexbox, the grid container also has a main axis and a cross axis. The justify content property is used to align the whole grid on the main axis. We can set different values to this property like center, space between, space around, start and end, and it will align the grid items according to that. Next we have the align content property, which aligns the grid items on the cross axis. For that, let's increase the height of our grid container. You can see now the grid items are vertically aligned in the center of the grid container. Again, it can take values like space between, space around, start or end. One thing to note here is the align content property will have any effect only when the grid's total height is less than the container's height. And similarly, the justify content property will have any effect only when the grid's total width is less than the container's width. Next, we can set the gaps between the rows and columns. The spaces between each rows and columns are known as gaps. For that, we can use properties like grid column gap or grid row gap. As you can see now, the columns are now 10 pixels apart and the rows are 50 pixels apart. We can also use the shorthand grid gap to set the row and column gap in one go. Here, the first value defines the row gap and the second value defines the column gap. If you enter only one value, then the rows and columns will be evenly spaced. These were the major properties of the grid container. Now let's see the properties of the individual grid items. For that, let's add individual distinct classes to each of our grid items. The lines which you can see on the screen are known as grid lines. The lines between the columns are the column lines and the line between the rows are known as row lines. You can use these line numbers to refer any grid item in the grid container. These line numbers are accessed by the property grid column start and grid column end, or grid row start and grid row end. For example, here you can see our first item starts from the first line and goes till the third line. Similarly, we can also do grid row start and grid row end. Now we also have a shorthand for this, so instead of doing grid column start and grid column end, you can just write grid column and you can specify the two values separated by a slash. Similarly, we can also do grid row. We can define the grid row start, row end and column end in one go using the grid area property. The grid area property takes 4 values. Here the item 1 starts at the row line 1 and column line 1 and goes till row line 3 and column line 3. We can also use the keyword span to define how many rows or columns the item will span. For example, if I want my item 1 to start at row line 1 and column line 1 and span 2 columns and 3 rows, we can do like this. You can see here that the item 1 spans 3 rows and 2 columns. Another very powerful feature of CSS Grids is that we can name our grid items. The grid items are named by the grid area property. So let's start naming all our items. Now to use these names, we'll go back to our grid container class and we'll define grid template areas. Let's first comment out grid template rows and columns. The grid template areas property defines a grid template by referencing to the names of grid which we just specified. Inside the grid template areas, each row is defined by a set of names surrounded in single or double quotes, each separated by a white space. Here, each name defines a single column. Repeating the names of the grid area causes the content to span those cells. If you want to specify empty cells, you can use the period character. For example, here you can see the empty cell created by the period character. The point here to note is each row in your declaration needs to have the same number of cells. It is indeed a very powerful feature of CSS Grids because you can see how we have created a complex structure using just few lines of code. Creating the same structure without using the grids feature would have been way more difficult. I hope this video would have helped you to understand CSS Grids. If you want further reading on the topic, follow the link in the description. Thank you for watching the video. Please hit the like button if you learned something. If you are new here, consider subscribing. See you in the next video. Till then, take care. Bye bye.